Hi everyone, my name is Daniel Woolfenden. I'm a senior philosophy major from Williams College, and my presentation today is on the moral evaluation of killing and letting die during end-of-life care. Um, I primarily focus on three main articles in my presentation, two of which are pretty famous. The first, Active and Passive Euthanasia by James Rachels, and the second, Why Does Removing Machines Count as Passive Euthanasia by Patrick Hopkins. And the third is by a relatively unknown author, Joachim Asscher, and it's his article, The Moral Distinction Between Killing and Letting Die in Medical Cases. And my argument is that Rachels and Hopkins effectively critique and destabilize the AMA's existing guidelines surrounding end-of-life care, or surrounding killing and letting die during end-of-life care. And in doing so, they motivate a new system to replace the AMA's existing guidelines, one which is capable of producing more coherent moral evaluations of killing and letting die during end-of-life care. I argue Asscher provides this system. He answers the call, or answers the motivation raised by Rachels and Hopkins. So I'm going to briefly explain Rachels and Hopkins' critiques of the AMA's original system, and then I'm going to explain Asscher's account, answer a potential conservative Catholic objection, and then suggest some further research. So Rachels and Hopkins, they're mainly critiquing this general sentiment within the AMA's existing system that sometimes it is permissible to let a patient die, but it is never permissible to kill a patient. And they outline three main objections with this general sentiment. First, that the AMA system embodies an inconsistency by allowing humaneness as a reason to let a patient die, but not as a reason to kill a patient. Secondly, that decisions which lead to a patient's death can be made on morally irrelevant grounds within the AMA system. So think of the intestinal blockage in the Baby Doe case. Just because Baby Doe is born with an intestinal blockage should not afford Baby Doe's parents to make a decision that leads to their child's death. Thirdly, the AMA system relies on a false belief that there's an intrinsic moral difference between killing and letting die. Hopkins focuses on the moral equivalence of withdrawing artificial treatment and killing a patient. And Rachel's argues, or one of the core elements of Rachel's arguments is that sometimes killing can be more morally weighty than letting die. Sometimes letting die can be more morally weighty than killing. And then in other situations, they can have equal moral weight. And he explains this third point by using his now famous bathtub analogy, in which the actions of Smith and Jones are equally morally despicable, despite Smith killing his cousin while Jones merely watches his cousin die. So it is in this way that Rachels and Hopkins destabilize the existing AMA system, and in doing so motivate a new system. And I believe this system is provided by Asscher. But when we look at Asscher's system, it's important to understand his view of responsibility. He sees it as something that can be passed from a patient to a doctor through consent. So, for example, if a patient consents to palliative care, the doctor can then accept responsibility for providing that patient with palliative care. Whereas if the patient accepts the active treatment, the doctor is now able to accept responsibility for providing the patient active treatment. So it is in this way that a patient can regulate the type of responsibility or the type of treatment a doctor is responsible for providing through consent. And it is these variable amounts of or types of responsibility that a doctor can have that interface differently with the actions of killing and letting die. And it's those differences which determine the the moral weight of each action during end-of-life care. So it may be a little bit confusing now, but I think as we run through the 3 relevant treatment types, it'll become more clear. So the 3 relevant treatment types during end-of-life care are active treatment, palliative care, and active killing. And there are 3 important questions that need to be answered when thinking about these 3 treatment types. First, is the patient's life worth living? Second, when should a patient consent to each type of treatment? And thirdly, what are the responsibilities at play for the doctor during each type of treatment? So a patient should request active treatment when the patient's life is worth living, and the harm involved in such treatment is justified by the potential benefit of that treatment. If these criteria are met, the patient would request active treatment, and then the doctor could then take responsibility for providing that patient active treatment. If, however, while the doctor has responsibility for providing that type of treatment, the doctor were to either knowingly kill the patient or knowingly let the patient die, both actions would involve ignoring the doctor's existing responsibility for providing the patient with active treatment, and thus the doctor would be taking responsibility for the death of that patient. However, as the patient's life was determined to be worth living initially, the doctor would be taking responsibility for the death of someone whose life was worth living. And this is an extremely morally significant or morally consequential act in Asscher's system. It's akin to, I guess, a more traditional view of murder. So this is an example where killing and letting die are of equal moral weight because both actions involve taking responsibility for the death of someone whose life was worth living. It's a slightly different scenario for palliative care because at its core, because the aim of palliative care is to maximize the patient's experience during remaining life rather than push for a cure and extend life. Palliative care, in its essence, is a form of letting die. So, when should a patient consent to palliative care? A patient should consent to palliative care when their life is worth living, but the potential benefit of treatment isn't justified by the harm involved. So if those criteria are met, the patient would request palliative care and consent to palliative care. The doctor would then be the type of responsibility the doctor could then accept would be limited to palliative care. So he would be taking responsibility for letting this patient die in the most humane way possible. If, however, the doctor, while they have this responsibility for providing palliative care, if the doctor were to kill the patient, then that would involve taking responsibility for the death of that patient, and as previously stated, the patient's life was worth living. So this would be another instance where the doctor would be taking responsibility for the death of someone whose life was worth living. And so in this scenario during palliative care, the action of killing is more morally weighty than letting die. So thirdly, active killing. If it can be determined that the patient's life is indeed not worth living, then to force them to live out the remainder of their life would be a form of harm. Think of a patient who is in a vegetative state with extreme lack of dignity and uncontrollable pain. It can be reasonably concluded that that patient's life is no longer worth living, and therefore to force them to live out the remaining weeks or years of their life would be a form of harm. And so the ethical thing to do in this situation would be to kill this patient. And importantly, the doctor would be taking responsibility for the death of that patient. However, as it has been determined that the life of that patient is no longer worth living, the doctor would be taking responsibility for a good thing. So this is an instance where killing, or where letting die is more morally severe than killing, because to force the patient to live out the remainder of their life is a form of harm. And this is akin to the moral intuition identified by Hopkins in his analysis of what he calls traps of nature. However, the conversation up until this point raises a really important question, which is, how does Asscher determine whether or not a patient's life is worth living? And he's relatively silent on this point and only offers this advice, that if we are going to determine that a patient's life is not worth living, it must be done with an extremely high degree of certitude because of the two potential mistakes that can be made, which are either killing a patient whose life is worth living, which as previously stated is extremely morally severe, or letting a patient die whose life is not worth living, so forcing them to live out the remainder of their life even though it's not worth living. So Asscher argues that the relative moral severity of those two mistakes, the killing being much more morally severe than the letting die instance, because of that relative difference, we need to be extremely certain if we're going to conclude that a patient's life is not worth living. He, however, doesn't offer a system for making such distinctions, which I think is important and which makes his view strong, and which brings us to our next slide. The conversation up until this point would be extremely uncomfortable for a conservative Catholic because they regard the value of human life as absolute. So this question of is this patient's life worth living is a little bit nonsensical to them because the value of human life is absolute. Therefore, we shouldn't be asking this question of is this patient's life worth living? And so that might be a potential objection that they raise against Asscher's system. However, I think that is where their objection lies within this system, and it's not merely a parochial concern. There are secular arguments to be made that question individuals and society's ability to make such distinctions. And I think, especially in the context of the death penalty, there are strong secular arguments to be made. For instance, Brian Stevenson, in his book Just Mercy, argues that this belief that individuals and society can make determinations about the value of human life has had a disproportionately negative effect on Black Americans, and therefore we shouldn't afford ourselves the ability to make such distinctions. And I think this is a strong argument, right, that the consequences of believing that we can make distinctions about the value of human life are so great that we shouldn't, that the potential benefit of reducing suffering during end-of-life care isn't justified by these unintended consequences. And an argument like this would compete with utilitarian moral philosophy, which may argue that the happiness of society would be maximized if we allow doctors to make such distinctions. So it is in this way, through this focused conversation that Asscher's system produces, that the Catholic objection can reside. It is within the system. It would be an argument for a model of care that is in line with the Catholic tradition, but it would also compete with more progressive views. And so it is not. So the Catholic objection isn't to Asscher's argument, it is within Asscher's argument. And I think this is the strength of Asscher's view. It isolates the values which lead to particular models of care, and then allows those values to interact to determine overall society's value, or the values of society, which then can lead to a model of care which is in line with the values that a society embraces. It's this kind of very democratic model in a way. However, I don't think that the utility of Asscher's argument should be limited to the killing and letting die debate. I think this model of isolating conversation and producing focused conversation can be useful in other realms as well, or in other arguments as well. And in particular, I think it would be useful in talking about the withholding versus withdrawing debate that has been propagated by Dominic Wilkinson and Julian Savulescu, specifically an article that they wrote, A Costly Separation Between Withdrawing and Withholding Treatment in Intensive Care. So in this article, they graphed the equivalence thesis onto issues of withholding versus withdrawing care for issues of resource allocation. And they argue that you should be able to withdraw care based on issues of resource allocation because of the equivalence thesis, essentially. And I think it's a little bit too simplistic to graft this idea onto this very complex issue, and that this conversation would benefit from and be progressed by Asscher's system, which produces this focused conversation. However, this research still has to be done, and I'm really looking forward to doing it. Yeah. So in summary, I briefly explained Rachels and Hopkins' critiques to the AMA's existing system and the way in which they motivate a new system for making these moral evaluations of killing and letting die during end-of-life care. Then I argue that Asscher provides such a system by explaining his view of responsibility and the way in which that affects particular treatment forms. Then I offered a potential Catholic objection, which I responded to, and suggested some further research. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I really appreciate your time and attention. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to email me. My email is provided. And I would just love to talk to anyone about these issues and my ideas. That would be great. And before I sign off, I need to say thank you to an important person. Dr. Julie Padroni was my mentor through this project. She advised me in my independent study, and I can't express how grateful I am for her help and her guidance and just her general mentorship. So thank you, Doctor. I appreciate it. And thank you again for bearing with me through this.